The first time I held the small brass key, the metal was warmer than it should have been, like it had been waiting in a closed hand. Its single tooth caught a slice of window light and threw it across an old wardrobe door, dark wood dust in the carvings, a lock the size of a dime. I turned the key once. The latch sighed. And somewhere inside the wood, something shifted, a hollow sound behind a board that shouldn't have moved. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I measure people's sleep for a living. In a lab above a quiet street in Indianapolis, I spend my days fitting soft leads behind ears, smoothing adhesive over temple skin, and watching the slow tide of brain waves creep across a monitor. When the morning rounds start, a pot of coffee hisses in the break room. The air hangs around 72 degrees, and the hall smells faintly of sanitizer and printer ink. For years, my life moved like a metronome, patients in pajama pants and house slippers. Their stories whispered across check-in desks, their dreams reduced to graphs that never argue back. It was steady work, the kind that keeps a mind from wandering too far into old rooms. Before the city, there was Harrisonville. 2 lanes into town, a water tower that made its own weather, and a diner that kept the pie case full even when the lunch crowd thinned. In late summer, the corn stood chest high a mile out, and you could hear cicadas even with the windows shut. Our neighborhood was a loop with one way in, and the same way out, the kind of place where porch swings counted as clocks, and the sound of a screen door told you who was home without looking. People waved from driveways. Folks kept a pair of work gloves in their pickup and a set of jumper cables under the front seat. If a storm knocked the power out, half the houses had a generator, and the other half knew who to call. Back then, our place was a white 2-story with a porch that leaned just enough to argue with your knees. My mother kept geraniums in clay pots along the steps and clipped grocery coupons at the kitchen table with a pencil tucked behind her ear. On school nights, she would set out 2 bowls for my brother and me, cereal if she had a sub-assignment the next morning, oatmeal if she didn't. My father worked a rotating shift at the parts plant off State Road 2, and on his swing weeks he returned after dark with his lunch pail and the smell of machine oil clinging to his sleeves. He'd drop quarters in a coffee can on the counter, laundry money, he said, and scrape his boots on the back stoop like it was a rule and not a habit. I shared a room with my brother Jamie. He was small and quick, always 3 steps ahead when the game was tag, and always 3 steps behind when it was bedtime. He slept with a stuffed bear tucked under his arm and told me it was because the bear knew the route to our grandparents' place without a map. We each had a twin bed, mine under the window, his against the far wall, and between us a rug that never lay flat. When the night air refused to budge, my father set a box fan in the hallway and told us it was the house breathing for us. The fan had a hiccup in the motor, and every few seconds its rhythm caught and started again. I'd listen to that soft stutter until sleep pulled me under like a tide. Across a narrow strip of side yard stood the Finch house with the blue porch rail and the maple tree that grew just enough branches to stretch into our yard. Eleanor Finch. Nora to me back then could climb that tree with bare knees and no fear, and she'd sit in the crook 2 limbs up like it was a front row seat to our room. On July evenings, she'd call down to us about fireflies and comic book trades and whether the Royals had any shot if the bullpen didn't fall apart. If my mother was on the phone or the television carried the weather out of Terre Haute, I'd crack the window and let the night talk come and go like a breeze. Harrisonville's rhythm was simple. Saturday mornings meant lawn mowers and country hits on radios that carried over fences. Wednesday evenings meant choir practice rolling down Ash Street if the church doors were open. If a kid wiped out on a bike, 3 porches lifted at once, and a bandage materialized before the crying stopped. No one locked their car doors at the gas station. People returned lost dogs with a handful of biscuits and a note on the collar, and more than one neighbor kept spare house keys under a flower pot that everyone pretended not to know about. There were rules you didn't need to write down. If my father left his tape measure on the porch swing, Mr. Callahan, from 2 doors down, would set it back on the railing after borrowing it, never once knocking. If my mother said be home before the streetlights came on, that meant the porch light would be waiting, and it meant dinner could be reheated without fuss if you made good time. Our bikes, an old red Huffy for me and a smaller blue one for Jamie, leaned against the same patch of siding every night in a pair that looked like parentheses around the hose spigot. Some evenings my father would stand in the yard, hands on his hips, and study the clouds, like he could read what they planned to do. He'd say, "You can smell rain in the corn before you see it," and I believed him even when the sky stayed clear. In that summer, the heat sat low and heavy. The kitchen clock clicked toward bedtime with a little hitch every minute, and we knew the sound well enough to call it by name. On those nights, my mother would stand in the doorway to our room after lights out one shoulder against the frame and remind us to keep our feet under the sheet or the night air would bite our ankles. Jamie would laugh and tuck his toes in, then sneak one back out like he was daring the dark to try something. I was older by 2 years old enough to pretend I didn't care about small rules, old enough to keep my eyes open until the fan's hiccup counted me backward into quiet. The wardrobe stood at the foot of Jamie's bed, a piece my grandmother left when she moved to assisted living in Kokomo. It was heavy enough that my father cussed every time we slid it to clean under it, and its doors fit tight when the humidity climbed. A few winters earlier, when the heat ran too dry, the wood shrank and the left door would click free on its own around 2 a.m, adding a soft knock to the house's vocabulary. My mother lined the shelves with contact paper printed in little blue flowers. On the top shelf, she kept a tin of winter scarves and a shoebox full of photos you couldn't look at without her permission. On the bottom, a stack of hand-me-down sweaters folded so square they could have been measured. Somewhere in there, beneath the feeling of thick wood under a palm, I learned the weight of furniture you trust to hold what it says it holds. Jamie and I had our rhythms, too. In the late afternoon, we'd race the length of the block to the street sign and back first to 5 Winds. At dusk, we'd collect china berries from the tree behind the garage and pretend they were baseballs, flicking them with bottle caps toward a strike zone chalked on the cinderblock wall. After bath time, he'd talk too much and I'd talk too little, and my mother would shake her head and tell us we'd end up sharing words in the middle if we didn't learn to meet in the room's center. When the night settled, we made our own quiet. I'd line up my action figures along the windowsill, each one a guard against the dark, and Jamie would make a tent of his top sheet and breathe like a runner catching his wind. Memory does a trick where it keeps only what it can stand the snap of our father's lighter when he took his last cigarette on the porch, the feel of the box fan's cord under bare toes, the soft thud of a basketball from 2 houses over, the way the mint toothpaste felt too cold when the faucet ran slow. I can see all of that clearly, a film loop lit from behind, and what I can't see sits between the frames. On one of those nights near the end of August, the town held on to its heat past sundown. It was still 84 at 10 o'clock, and the asphalt had given the day back to the air piece by piece. Bugs swung low under the lone street lamp by the Finch driveway, drawing circles that looked like snow in the right kind of tired. My father was on swing shift, which meant his truck would nose into the driveway sometime after midnight without the headlights, and my mother had left a plate wrapped in foil in the oven for him set to warm. I'd read a comic under the sheet until the bedside lamp got too hot to hold on to, and then I clicked it off and let the dark settle. Jaime muttered to his bear about a game we'd finish tomorrow, and then rolled once-twice until the mattress sighed. From the window, the night sounded as familiar as our own kitchen. The maples whispered in the shallow wind, the neighbor's AC compressor kicked, and somewhere 2 blocks over, someone's radio let out a static bent chorus. The house made its own small noises, old wood, and a slow pipe. When you grow up inside a certain set of sounds, you start to trust them to mean nothing at all. If a step creaks on the stairs at 11 p.m., it's the house remembering how to hold itself up and not a footfall. If the back door shifts in its frame, it's the pressure changing. If the closet door leans forward an inch on a sticky hinge, It's July talking, not something you need to stand up and fix. I remember the hallway light wearing a towel of moths that night, and my mother clicking it off one room at a time, first the kitchen, then the front room, then the hall. She whispered goodnight like she always did, a fingertip brushing the doorframe as she passed. The smell in the house was summer laundry, sun-warmed cotton, and a hint of line-dried soap. I could have found the bathroom in the dark without touching the wall. I could have found the cereal bowls with my eyes closed. I could have told you which floorboard chirped near the closet and which one stayed silent under a careful heel. Just before I slipped under, a little note of air changed in the room, the kind you only hear when you've trained yourself to listen for small things. The fan hesitated, missed a beat, and then found its rhythm again. It wasn't new. It did that when the thermostat clicked and the unit turned over. Jaime made a sleepy sound and pulled his sheet higher. I watched the wardrobe's left door catch a thread of street lamp glow and give it back dull and steady. Outside, a car crossed the four-way 2 blocks down and rolled on without stopping. The porch light next door blinked once and stayed bright. If you had asked me in that hour whether Harrisonville ever surprised me, I'd have said no. That town showed you what it was and returned it again the next day. Porches you could read like calendars. Voices you could place without seeing faces. The same prayer line on Sunday, the same rolled-up garden hose hanging like a spare rib from the siding. Nothing rushed. Nothing broke without noise. When anything changed, you felt it in the way people talked across the fence, a half-second of quiet before the laugh. That night I counted backward from 100 like my mother taught me when I was little and afraid of thunderstorms. 98, 96. The box fan clung to its rhythm like a clock with a hiccup. A car door down the street thunked shut, and footsteps tapped across a driveway that wasn't ours. The maple leaves ticked together like cards shuffled slowly. Somewhere a dog barked once and then made up its mind to leave it alone. I stared at the ceiling until the dark stopped being a ceiling and became just air, weightless, ordinary safe. I left the window cracked for the breeze. The curtains hardly moved, and long after the porch light next door should have gone dark, it stayed on a patient eye on an empty street. The porch light next door was still burning when the morning sun pushed through the curtains. I remember thinking the glow looked wrong in daylight, like a match that forgot to go out. The fan in our hallway had already been unplugged. Its cord lay coiled on the floor beside the wall outlet, just where my father always left it before heading to work. I blinked against the sunlight, heavy with that half-sleep feeling where dreams don't quite let go, and I waited for the familiar rustle of my brother moving under his blanket. It never came. The house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that feels safe. It was the kind that sounds like something has already happened, and you've arrived too late to stop it. I turned toward his bed, expecting to see the rise of his shoulders, maybe the bear tucked under his arm. But the sheets were smooth, the pillow cold. The stuffed bear sat upright against the headboard like someone had posed it that way on purpose. I didn't move for a few seconds. I just stared, half hoping my eyes would adjust and find him crouched on the floor with his comics or hiding behind the wardrobe waiting to jump out. But the air in that room was still, and every part of me knew he wasn't there. I called for my mom first. My voice cracked halfway through her name. She came up the stairs fast, a towel in one hand, hair still damp from her shower. I can still see the look that flashed across her face before she spoke, a quick flicker of confusion that turned sharp, like she'd been pulled out of a dream she didn't want to finish. She searched the corners of the room, then the hallway, then the bathroom. She called out for him twice, her voice lighter than normal, as if keeping it casual would make it so. By the time my father came home, the search had already spilled out onto the front lawn. Neighbors gathered before noon. I remember Mr. Callahan from 2 doors down leaning against his truck, asking if maybe my brother had gone to the creek behind the school. My mother shook her head, said he never went anywhere without telling someone first. Someone suggested maybe he'd sleepwalked. Kids do that sometimes, but even at 8, Jamie was too cautious for that. He liked his routines, his little bedtime checklist. Brush teeth, straighten bare check, the glow stars on the ceiling. I told the police that. They wrote it down like it mattered. The window was locked from the inside, same as every morning. There were no footprints in the dirt outside, no screen pried loose, no broken latch. Nothing. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole and left the rest of us untouched. Those next few days moved like someone had pressed slow motion on the world. Search teams combed the woods, the creek beds, the fields behind the old grain silo. Helicopters came in low enough that the sound rattled the windows and made the porch light sway on its chain. Every time I heard the rotors fade, I imagined them carrying away the chance of finding him. The air smelled of cut grass and diesel. Neighbors brought casseroles we didn't touch, and the living room filled with voices trying not to sound like prayers. At night, my mother kept a lamp burning in the window, same one she used to read by when we were little. It threw a soft amber glow across the yard, and for years after, I couldn't look at that house without seeing that light still burning. I told the police everything I could remember, but the list was short. We'd brushed our teeth side by side the night before, fought over toothpaste like always, and climbed into our beds. I remembered the sound of the fan catching once the soft click of the hallway switch when Mom turned off the lights, and then nothing. They asked if I heard anyone come in, or if Jaime had said anything strange before bed. I said no. The truth was, the last clear sound I could recall was my brother laughing about something a joke I can't even remember now, and then silence. They took my fingerprints from the wardrobe handles, dusted the window frame, and carried out the bear in a plastic evidence bag. That image stuck with me more than anything, the bear's glass eyes peering through the plastic, the head tilted slightly as if confused. After the first week, the news trucks left town. The flyers started to curl at the edges. My father stopped talking to people who came by with new theories. My mother kept cleaning Jamie's side of the room until there was nothing left to straighten. I remember the day she folded his blanket for the last time. She pressed her hand flat against it like she was smoothing out wrinkles in memory. That night I heard her crying through the wall. My father told me later she dreamt of hearing Jamie's footsteps on the stairs, but when she opened the door, no one was there. I didn't dream at all. For a long time I didn't let myself. Eventually they said words like abduction and without a trace. And I learned to hate how calm those phrases sounded. As if naming the void could fill it. I was 10, and suddenly every noise meant something. The creak in the hallway wasn't wood shifting anymore. It was a warning. The fan's hiccup became a heartbeat I couldn't control. I'd wake up and stare at that empty bed until my eyes burned. The house got smaller every day. The years rolled forward whether we wanted them to or not. By the time I was in high school, the police file was thin enough to fit in one manila folder. My father kept it in his desk drawer like a secret he couldn't throw away. I graduated, went to college, and found myself studying sleep science, partly because I wanted to understand what happens when the body shuts down, but mostly because I was still trying to answer a question I never could. How could I have slept through it? How could a child vanish 3 feet away without a sound? That thought followed me into adulthood, like a shadow that refused to stay behind. Decades later, life looked almost normal again. I had a small condo on the north side of Indianapolis, a job that paid on time colleagues who called me Dr. Carter, even when I told them not to. My parents divorced somewhere along the way. Grief has a way of carving two people in opposite directions. My father passed in 2009, a stroke that came quick. My mother moved west to be near her sister. I buried myself in work, running overnight studies, calibrating monitors, learning to live inside other people's dreams instead of my own. For a long time, I believed the past had gone quiet. Then one morning that spring, the mailroom clerk handed me a small envelope. No return address. No postage stamp, just a local postmark from Harrisonville. My first thought was that it had been forwarded from my mother's old address. The envelope was yellowed stiff, like it had been tucked away for years. My name was written in faint pencil, the zip code smudged by a thumbprint or maybe dirt. I almost tossed it in the recycling bin with the rest of the junk mail, but something stopped me. Maybe the handwriting had that uneven tilt of someone trying to disguise familiarity. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message read, "He never left the room." Underneath, taped to the page with clear tape, was a small brass key. I don't know how long I sat there staring at it. The key was old-fashioned, rounded-head single-tooth worn smooth along the edges. I knew it instantly. It didn't belong to any house or lockbox. It belonged to that wardrobe, the one that used to sit at the foot of our beds, the one my father refused to sell when we cleaned out the house after the divorce. He'd moved it to the basement for storage, then sold it years later at a yard sale to a man whose name we never got. I hadn't thought about it in decades. Now it was sitting on my desk in the middle of a normal workday, glinting in the sunlight like it had something to say. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was some kind of cruel prank. Maybe someone found my old address online, maybe a coincidence, maybe nothing. But when I turned the key over in my palm, I felt that same warmth from memory, as if it had been held by someone who wanted me to feel it. My hands were shaking. I slipped the key into a specimen envelope and locked it in my desk drawer. That should have been the end of it. But an hour later, while reviewing a patient's sleep report, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. When I pressed play, a woman's voice came through, older now, but familiar. "Dr. Carter," she said softly. "I don't know if you remember me. My name's Eleanor Finch. I used to live next door to you back in Harrisonville." My breath caught. She hesitated before continuing. "I think I saw something the night your brother disappeared, but no one ever asked me. I was just a kid. There was a pause, the kind where you can hear someone choosing whether to finish. Then quieter, I've been having dreams lately. I think they're memories, or both. Something's wrong in that house, Ryan. Something was always wrong. If you want to know what happened, come back before someone else disappears." The message ended. I played it twice more just to be sure I wasn't hearing things. Eleanor Finch. She'd moved away not long after Jamie vanished. I hadn't spoken to her since I was 11. Now, 3 decades later, she was saying she saw something that night, and that something in that house was still wrong. That evening I drove home without remembering the traffic lights. I sat at my kitchen counter with the letter on one side, the brass key on the other, and the voicemail still ringing in my head. The air conditioner clicked on blowing cold air that didn't reach me. Outside, the trees along the street were just beginning to leaf out, the world turning green again like it always does. But for me, that morning had cracked something open. For years, I'd built a life on the idea that the past was sealed. Now, I wasn't so sure. By the time the sun went down, I'd already booked a rental car. The thought of returning to Harrisonville made my chest tighten, but I knew I was going. Maybe I just needed to see the house one more time, to stand in that room and prove to myself there was nothing left to find. Or maybe deep down I already knew the truth, that whatever took my brother never really left. As I shut off the kitchen light, the brass key caught the last glint from the window and threw it across the counter in a thin, bright line. I watched it fade until the room went dark. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left, steady and familiar, just like the fan from all those years ago. And for the first time in 33 years, I realized I wasn't sure if I'd ever really woken up from that night. The road into Harrisonville hadn't changed much. 2 lanes narrowing under the trees, a few new road signs where the asphalt had been patched, but the rest looked exactly as I remembered, like time had folded the edges of the map and kept this place hidden from the years that had passed. I crossed the same small bridge where my father used to slow down to point out turtles in the creek, and the same diner still sat at the corner with the hand-painted sign that once read, "Breakfast served all day." It was faded now, missing the B and the K, so it just said, "Breakfast all day." The parking lot was empty. I drove past the elementary school, the ball field, the turnoff, to our old neighborhood, each one carrying a version of my brother's laughter somewhere in the air. When I finally turned onto Ash Grove Lane, it hit me. The sound of gravel under the tires was the same. Everything else was older tired. The houses had faded paint and leaning mailboxes. Even the trees looked thinner, like they'd stopped trying to grow. Our old place stood half-hidden behind a tangle of shrubs, white siding gone gray porch swing hanging from one rusted chain. The air smelled like rain that hadn't decided whether to fall. I parked across the street and just sat there for a while. The house didn't scare me. It unsettled me like seeing a reflection that didn't blink when you did. It was strange to think that so much of my life had been defined by this one patch of ground, every hallway, every door. I hadn't been back since my father's funeral, and even then I'd only stayed long enough to sign papers, stand at the gravesite, and leave. But now I wasn't here for him. I was here for the space he'd left behind. The letter in my pocket weighed heavier than the key beside it. I could still hear Eleanor's voice on that voicemail, older now, steadier, but trembling underneath. Something was always wrong, she'd said. I couldn't get those words out of my head. The porch boards groaned when I stepped onto them. The front door wasn't locked. It swung open with a low sigh like it had been waiting to exhale. The smell hit me first, a mixture of dust, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of something rotted long ago. Sunlight filtered through warped curtains, scattering pale rectangles across the floor. Everything inside was covered with white sheets, furniture ghosted beneath them, corners thick with cobwebs. The living room looked smaller than I remembered, the fireplace cold and cracked, the mantel bare except for a ring of dust where my mother's clock once sat. I walked slowly, letting the floorboards announce me with each step. My shoes left tracks in the dust. On the coffee table, a faint circular stain marked the spot where Jamie had once spilled orange juice and cried for hours, thinking he'd ruined it. That mark had outlived everyone who cared about it. The hallway was empty now, stripped of family photos, but I could still see their outlines on the wallpaper, the pale silhouettes where the color had been spared from sunlight. Each nail hole caught the light like a pinpoint of memory. I followed them past the kitchen, past the spot where our growth chart had been penciled on the doorframe. Someone had tried to scrub it away, but the ghost of those lines still clung there, faint grooves carved by pencil tips and years. My name had been taller than his by almost 2 inches the summer he disappeared. I stopped at the foot of the stairs, hand resting on the rail. For a moment I thought I heard it, the faint hum of a box fan, the rhythmic stutter I hadn't heard in decades. It was probably just the wind through a cracked window, but I froze anyway, waiting for the sound to settle. When I reached the top, my chest felt tight. The house hadn't been cleaned or staged or cleared for anyone. It was as if time had sealed it the moment we left. Jamie's room, our room, waited at the end of the hall, the door slightly open, the same way my mother used to leave it for the nightlight. I pushed it open with my fingertips, half afraid it would resist. The sight on the other side made my knees go weak. 2 twin beds, one with a red blanket, one with blue. A small desk in the corner covered in old comic pages pinned under glass. The same corkboard with yellowed clippings, even the same drawing tacked near the top, a lopsided dinosaur labeled in crayon Jamosaurus rex. None of this should have been here. My mother had cleared this room after the investigation, sold most of it, boxed up the rest. But here it all was untouched, waiting. The wardrobe stood at the foot of the far bed, dull wood darkened with age. The brass key in my pocket seemed to warm against my leg as if it knew. I pulled it out and turned it over once, twice before slipping it into the lock. The click that followed was soft, final. The doors creaked open. A wave of air came out, stale, heavy, with that deep earth smell of long-sealed spaces. Inside, empty shelves lined with peeling floral paper. But something about the back panel didn't look right. The wood sat uneven, a faint seam visible near the edge. I ran my fingers along it and felt the indentations, small, shallow scratches clustered low near where a child's hands might reach. Crescent marks, fingernail deep. My breath caught. I leaned closer and knocked lightly. Hollow. There was space behind it. My heart began to race, but my hands stayed steady. I pressed along the top edge until I found it a small ridge, maybe a latch built into the grain. When I pushed it, the panel shifted inward with a sigh, revealing a narrow crawl space no wider than 4 feet. The beam from my phone flashlight cut through the dust, and the air moved for the first time in decades. Inside was a nest of blankets, gray and stiff with mold. Crayon drawings covered the wall, stick figures, animals. A house and then something else. A pair of eyes, large and dark, staring straight out. Below them, 2 words in a child's scrawl. Princess Room. I crouched the edge of the wood, digging into my knee, and that's when I saw it, something red in the corner. A small plastic recorder, faded and cracked, the kind kids used before phones ever existed. Jamie's recorder. The one he'd carried everywhere. My throat tightened. I reached for it carefully. The battery door was gone, but a cassette was still inside. I backed out slowly, every muscle tense. My hands were trembling as I set the recorder on the bedspread. For a long minute, I just stared at it. There was a sticker on the bottom, almost worn off, but I could still make out his handwriting, Jamie Private. The same block letters he used to label his school folders. I thought about plugging it into my phone, about hearing his voice again after all these years, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was fear. Maybe I didn't want the answers yet. Before I could decide, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number again. I hit play without thinking. A whisper filled my ear. You shouldn't have come back. Then silence. No breath, no background noise, just that one line. I stood frozen, listening to the static that followed my pulse, beating so hard I could hear it in my jaw. I replayed it, but it cut off at the exact same second. I tried calling back, nothing. The number wasn't traceable. The house around me felt smaller, now the air thicker, like it had shifted closer. I picked up the recorder, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and stepped out of the room, closing the door behind me. The latch caught on its own the way it used to when the humidity swelled the wood. That night, I checked into the only motel still operating near the highway. It was the kind of place where the air conditioner rattled against the window frame and the carpet smelled faintly of cigarettes from 30 years ago. I didn't unpack. I sat on the edge of the bed with the recorder in my hands. My thumb hovered over the play button for a long time before I finally pressed it. The tape hissed, then popped, then came to life. A child's voice, his voice. Testing, testing. Hi, this is Jamie Carter. I'm 8, I think. The sound of shuffling followed, then a man's voice. Calm. Warm. You're home, Jamie. This is your special room. The blood drained from my face. That voice was my father's. There was a pause. Then Jamie again, whispering, It's dark now. I think he's in here with me. Not Daddy. The other one. The tape ended there, a click like someone hitting stop. I sat in that motel room until the sun began to creep through the blinds. My father had been dead for years, buried with full honors as a decent man who worked hard and loved his family. But that voice, I would have sworn to it in any courtroom. And what my brother said near the end of the tape, that single phrase the other one repeated in my head until it lost shape. I wanted to tell myself it was nonsense, that the recording was nothing more than the game of a child with a wild imagination. But I couldn't. Not after hearing the fear in his voice. I tried calling Eleanor the next morning. It rang twice, then voicemail. I left a message. It's Ryan. I'm here. I found something. Call me. I hung up and stared at my phone like it owed me an answer. The recorder sat on the nightstand beside a styrofoam cup of cold coffee. The words on the tape had burned away the distance of 33 years in a single night. Whatever had happened to my brother, it wasn't random. It wasn't over either. Outside, the sky had turned that washed-out gray that comes before a storm. The air smelled like ozone and cut grass. I looked toward the direction of Ash Grove Lane and realized I couldn't leave yet. There was more in that house, something my father had hidden, something that letter had tried to point me toward. I didn't know what it was, only that the message in the mail had been right. Chimey never left that room. Not really. When I got back in the car, the brass key sat on the passenger seat, catching the light from the window. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I reached over, closed my hand around it, and turned the ignition. The engine hummed low, steady, almost like breathing. Somewhere through the hum of it, I thought I heard the faint click of a tape recorder starting again. The storm rolled in just after sunset. Not the violent kind, but slow and heavy, the kind that makes the air feel charged before a drop ever falls. I drove back toward the house with the wipers sliding across a thin mist, the highway lights pulling long yellow lines through the windshield. Eleanor had called an hour earlier, her voice quiet, careful. "I'm still in town," she said. "We need to meet. There's something you should see." I didn't ask what. I already knew we were past small explanations. When I turned down the gravel road toward the old trailhead, I saw her car parked under a bare sycamore, her headlights dimmed, engine running for the heat. She was sitting on a bench by the gate when I stepped out. Her hair was damp, tied back the same way she used to wear it when we were kids. She looked up and said, "You really came back?" I nodded. There wasn't anything left to say about it. We walked the first quarter mile without talking. The woods around us were slick with rain, the air cool enough to taste metal. I could hear the faint drip of water from the leaves above the way sound folds around itself when it has nowhere to go. Finally, she stopped near a fallen log and turned toward me. "I didn't lie," she said. "I did see something that night, but I didn't understand what it was until now." Her eyes didn't meet mine. They were fixed somewhere just over my shoulder, as if she was watching the memory happen again. "I saw a light from your window." "No, not the window, the closet. I thought it was a flashlight or maybe your dad looking for something, but then I saw a movement. Small, like a kid crawling. Then the light went out." The words hung there a moment before she added, "No one came back out. It's strange what the mind does when truth starts to push through after years of silence." I felt my chest tighten, like hearing my own name spoken from another room. I told her about the wardrobe, the hidden space, the drawings, the recorder. I told her I'd heard Jamie's voice and our father's too. When I said it out loud, the wind picked up, scattering the rain through the trees like 1,000 small sighs. She didn't look surprised. "I've been dreaming about that house," she said. "In the dreams I can hear him." "Jaime," he whispers from inside the walls. "Sometimes he says your name." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a cassette wrapped in a paper towel. "This was left on my porch last week," she said. "No note, no explanation. I haven't listened to it. I thought maybe you'd know what to do with it." The tape was worn, the label rubbed off, except for a strip of red tape around the edge. I turned it over in my hand and felt a chill run through me. I'd spent my career studying what happens when the brain falls asleep, but nothing in any textbook could explain what it feels like to touch an object that seems to remember for you. "There's something else," she said. "Last night the light was on again in your closet. We stood there in the rain, both of us facing the dark stretch of woods that led back to town. I asked if she was sure. She just nodded. "That room hasn't had power in years," she said softly. "And yet—" Her voice trailed off. Somewhere behind us, a truck passed on the county road, headlights flashing between the trees, then fading. She turned back to me. "Whatever's in that house, it's not finished with you." I drove back with the new tape on the passenger seat, the label gleaming each time lightning broke across the sky. By the time I reached the motel, the rain had stopped, but thunder still rumbled somewhere far off. Inside, the air smelled of damp carpet and stale coffee. I sat on the bed and slipped the cassette into the same recorder I'd found in the crawl space. My hands were steady until I pressed play. The tape hissed, then cleared. A woman's voice whispered, too calm, too practiced. "He doesn't sleep like the others. He listens. We'll have to move him soon." Then silence, followed by that same lullaby. Brahms slowed to a crawl, its notes warped and tired. Underneath it, faintly, the sound of scratching, like fingernails on wood. I stopped the tape and just listened to the silence that followed. Every shadow in that room seemed to lean toward me. The others, she'd said. That meant more children, not just Jamie. My mind turned over the detailed session subject experiment. It wasn't just a crime. It was organized clinical. I thought of my father's calm voice on the first recording, the way he'd said, "You're home, Jamie." What kind of man could speak like that in a place built to break his own child? I didn't want to believe it, but part of me already did. By morning, I was back at the house. I parked down the street, this time engine off, and walked the last half block in the mist. The front door gave easily again. Inside, the air was colder, like the temperature had dropped overnight. The silence had weight to it. I made my way upstairs, each step slow, careful. When I reached the bedroom, the wardrobe door was already open, the back panel ajar. I crouched and looked inside. The blankets were there, the drawings too, but something had changed. The dust near the far corner had been disturbed. I crawled in the beam of my flashlight, cutting through the dark, and found a loose floorboard cracked at one end. When I pulled it up, the air that came out was sharp and dry. Beneath it, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. My hands shook as I lifted it. Inside were 5 Polaroid photographs. I didn't want to look, but I did. The first showed Jamie sitting cross-legged on the floor in those same pajamas he'd worn the night he vanished. He was holding the red recorder. His eyes looked swollen, his smile forced. In the second, a shadow stood behind him, tall face blurred by motion, one hand resting on Jamie's shoulder. In the third, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, sat on a mattress in what looked like the same crawl space, her eyes red from crying. The fourth showed a hallway lined with concrete walls, a steel door at the end stenciled with words I could barely make out. Session 5 observation. The fifth was just text scrawled on a torn piece of paper. We sleep under them. They don't know the walls listen. The house isn't theirs. It's ours. I could hardly breathe. The photos trembled in my hand, their edges damp with sweat. Whoever took them had known exactly what they were doing. This wasn't random. It was a record. The phone in my pocket buzzed, then startling me. Another unknown number. I put it on speaker. A man's voice, low and even. "You opened the floor," he said. Pause. "Now you've invited them back." Then the line went dead. I sat there in the dark, the house breathing around me, and for the first time since that letter arrived, I understood how deep this went. It wasn't just a secret hidden inside one family home. It was something built to last, a structure designed to watch and record and wait. I could feel it in the walls, in the way the air shifted when I moved. Every childhood sound I'd once trusted, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the fan, felt like part of a pattern I was only now beginning to hear. I picked up the recorder, tucked the Polaroids into my jacket, and forced myself toward the stairs. The basement door stood where it always had paint-chipped hinges rusted. I hesitated at the top step, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The wood groaned under my weight as I descended. It smelled the same old concrete, wet soil, faint traces of oil from my father's tools. But underneath it was something new, something sour. The light switch didn't work. I followed the beam of my flashlight across the walls until it landed on a door I'd forgotten existed, one my father had always said led to storage. I'd never seen it open. The knob was cold to the touch, and around the keyhole were tiny scratches, old but deliberate. I reached into my pocket. The brass key from the letter fit perfectly. The lock turned with a sound that didn't belong to any normal door. When I pulled it open, the air that came out was thick and wrong, like something had been sealed inside for too long. My flashlight caught the edge of a bed, small pink with faded princess decals peeling from the frame. The walls were lined with foam panels, the kind used for soundproofing. A camera mount sat empty in the corner. On a small desk were 6 notebooks, stacked neatly, each labeled in pencil, Session 1 through Session 6. My hands moved before my mind caught up. I opened the first one. Inside rows of clinical notes in tidy handwriting described subject responses, obedience thresholds, verbal regression. The words read like experiments. Subject compliant. No longer asks for mother. Introduce nightly protocol. I turned another page. Subject 4. J. Carter. Observation terminated. My throat closed. Below that, in a different pen, Subject 5. R. Carter. Withdrawn from cohort. The handwriting was my father's. I dropped the notebook. It hit the floor with a soft thud that echoed louder than it should have. For a long moment, I just stood there breathing the stale air, staring at the words that told me everything I never wanted to know. I followed the wall with my hand until my fingers brushed a seam in the foam. When I pulled, a hidden panel gave way. Behind it was another door, metal this time, with a small nameplate bolted near the top. Observation Unit 4B. Property of Project Promise. I whispered the words out loud, testing them against the air. They didn't sound human. They sounded bureaucratic, institutional, like something that belonged in a facility, not a family basement. Before I could think, my phone buzzed again. The same calm voice from before. You weren't supposed to remember, it said. But you always had trouble sleeping, didn't you? Ryan, that's why he didn't take you too. Now that you're awake, we'll be coming back. Then the click of the line ending. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I backed toward the stairs, the brass key slick with sweat in my palm. At the top, I turned once more toward the dark room below and whispered barely loud enough to hear myself. What did you do, Dad? The answer didn't come, but the silence that followed felt almost alive. When I stepped outside, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, the air washed clean, but I couldn't shake the sense that the house was still listening. I stayed there until sunrise, watching the first light hit the side of the house. It caught on the windows like frost turned the cracked paint almost silver. The storm had passed, but the air still carried that faint smell of ozone and damp earth, the kind that settles into your clothes. My hands were still shaking when I locked the door behind me. It felt wrong to leave it open even after everything I'd seen. Maybe part of me still wanted to believe that locking it could hold the darkness inside, or at least keep it from following me home. By mid-morning, there were police cars lined along the street. I'd called Eleanor at dawn, and she called the sheriff. I told them everything, the hidden rooms, the notebooks, the photographs. I didn't mention the calls. Some things I already knew would sound like madness if you hadn't lived with them. The officers went in pairs, moving through the house with flashlights and latex gloves, quiet as mourners. I waited by the mailbox, staring down the long stretch of asphalt where my brother had last been seen alive. After a while, an older detective came out. His face was unreadable. He carried one of the notebooks sealed in a clear evidence bag. "We'll be taking the rest," he said. I nodded, and he asked if I needed someone to call. I told him no. I'd already made every call that mattered. They spent the entire day digging through that basement. I stayed on the curb, watching the back and forth of uniforms, the blue gloves flashing in the light, the steady rhythm of radios. Around mid-afternoon, a van pulled up from Indianapolis Crime Scene Unit. They brought ground-penetrating radar, a forensics tech with a gray ponytail, and a state investigator who spoke in low tones to the sheriff. At one point, I caught a glimpse of something being carried out on a stretcher. It was small, wrapped carefully, but even at a distance I knew. I didn't ask. You learn over time that some questions only serve to reopen what's already been answered. They worked through the night, sealing off the house, mapping the underground structure that stretched farther than anyone expected. Beneath the basement, through that steel door, they found a network of tunnels, hand-dug in some places, reinforced in others. Rooms carved into the dirt, soundproofed, wired for electricity long since cut. In one, they found remnants of what looked like a recording setup, old cameras, reels, notebooks. The words Project Promise appeared again and again. It turned out my father hadn't built those rooms alone. There were names in the files, scientists, government contractors, a defunct research wing that once received federal grants in the 70s and quietly vanished from record. What began in laboratories had found its way into basements, private homes, ordinary lives, and Harrisonville wasn't the only town. The investigation stretched on for months. Federal agents combed through property records, bank statements, every address my father had ever listed. Most of the names tied to the project were already dead. A few weren't. They were men in their 80s, tucked away in nursing homes or remote ranch houses, too far gone to remember or pretending to be. No one could say exactly how many children were involved, how many families had been told a story like ours, a disappearance without witness, a town that moved on. The case was sealed under multiple jurisdictions. To this day, I don't know everything they found. They let me read one report heavily redacted, its margins blacked out like the truth was something classified. All it said about my brother was a single line. Subject deceased approximate year undetermined. Eleanor gave her statement, then left town again. She couldn't stay. The dreams had started coming back, she said. Lights in her windows at night, whispers she couldn't trace. I understood. The mind doesn't care how many years have passed. It keeps the shape of fear long after the danger is gone. We stayed in touch for a while, mostly short messages, holiday cards. After a few years, those stopped too. I don't blame her. We all moved differently through the same wreckage. For me, life shrank down to something simple. I went back to work, finished the reports that had piled up on my desk, but my focus never came back the way it used to. I'd sit in my lab watching people drift into sleep under the soft hum of machines, and I'd wonder what dreams were left in them that someone hadn't tried to rewrite. I started sleeping in short bursts, 3 hours here, 2 there. When I did dream, it was always the same, a key turning in a lock, a door sighing open, and a voice saying, "You're home." I'd wake up with the taste of metal in my mouth like I'd bitten my tongue. Eventually, I sold the house. The county wanted to demolish it, but a preservation group stepped in, arguing it was part of local history. They had no idea what kind. The land sits empty now, fenced off, marked with a warning about unstable ground. Every so often, a thrill seeker or ghost hunter tries to get inside. They don't find much, just concrete dirt silence. The tunnels have collapsed or been filled in depending on which report you believe. The rest was hauled away in boxes labeled evidence. I don't think anything truly left that place. The air still carries it. When the case finally closed, I stood in the courthouse parking lot holding a copy of the final report. The judge called it a tragedy rooted in deception. I called it what it was, a family built on secrets, a father who turned science into something unrecognizable. The prosecutors couldn't charge a dead man, and everyone else tied to it had long escaped justice through death or dementia. In the end, there were no arrests, just confirmation. Sometimes that's all the truth can give you, a shape, not a punishment. I buried the last of Jamie's things that winter. The red recorder, the bear, the drawings. I didn't want them boxed in evidence or displayed in some archive. I found a quiet patch of woods near the river, the same one where we used to skip stones. I dug with my hands until the soil turned soft. I placed everything inside and covered it slowly, one handful at a time. When I finished, I sat back and listened to the river. It sounded the same as it had when we were kids, steady and different. That sound is the only thing I trust to be honest anymore. It's strange the way grief ages. At first, it burns sharp, defined. You think you can trace its edges, learn to live around it. But with time, it settles into something quieter. It stops asking for your attention and just stays there, woven into every hour you don't speak of it. People like to say closure comes from answers from justice, but I've learned it comes from something else entirely. It comes from deciding which ghosts you're willing to live beside. I still visit Harrisonville once a year. The drive takes about 2 hours if the traffic's light. I park near the bridge walk, the same stretch of road I used to ride my bike down, and leave a single daisy at the edge of what used to be our front yard. No one ever notices. The town has grown quieter, older. The diner's been torn down, replaced by a convenience store that sells lottery tickets and cigarettes. The old church still rings its bell every Sunday, even if there's barely a dozen people left inside. Sometimes, when the wind carries right, I swear I can hear a box fan somewhere in the distance, that same uneven rhythm catching for just a second before it steadies again. There's one memory that stayed sharper than all the rest. It's of that night before everything broke, the porch light next door still burning long after midnight, the sound of crickets. My brother's laughter fading into sleep. I remember lying there thinking how small our world was, how safe it felt inside that little loop of houses and sidewalks. And I think that's what hurts the most. Not just what we lost, but how ordinary it all was before. How easily the dark fit itself into something that looked like home. In the years since I've told this story only a handful of times, every time I do, someone asks the same question: how did you survive it? I never know how to answer. I suppose survival isn't something you decide. It's what happens when the truth refuses to let you rest. It keeps you moving even when all you want is to stop. It makes you remember. The investigators told me once that the files from Project Promise had been archived in a federal facility sealed under restricted classification. National interest, they said. I don't expect they'll ever be made public, but every so often I get a letter in the mail with no return address, just a line of handwriting I recognize. It's always the same. They never stopped building. I don't know who sends them. Maybe Eleanor. Maybe someone else who lived through their own version of what we did. I don't reply. Some stories end not with an answer but with an echo. I keep one of the notebooks on my shelf, Session 4, the one they let me keep after the trial. The pages are brittle, the ink faded, but there's a drawing on the last page that wasn't in any report. A stick figure holding another's hand beneath a crooked sun. Under it, in a child's writing, are the words, "We can go home now." I don't know if Jaime drew it or if it was meant for him. Either way, I like to think he found his way out, even if I never did. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator, I'll catch myself listening. Not for danger, just for the silence between things. That's where the truth lives now. Not in the reports or the interviews or the graves, but in the spaces we fill with memory. I think that's all any of us can do. Listen to what remains and promise not to turn away. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.